Alright, Wayne here, sharing some more with you about an incident that happened at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. And a lot of the details I know, I was involved in some small parts of it, but this is just sort of one of those stories that is interesting, and you may have read about it. One of the persons involved, a movie was made about them, an inmate, and I'll talk about him a little bit, and I'll probably tell another story about him, more details later on. But Central Prison, as a maximum security prison, typically did not have inmates escape from it. I mean, it just didn't happen. Most time when it did happen, it was inmates that were taken on, transported outside the facility. Maybe were on work details outside the facility, some of the minimum custodies that were assigned there that would walk off, that kind of thing. Central Prison, if you go back in the history of it, not so much as the part now, but a lot of the rigid structure was stone that was quarried right there close to it. A large wall was around it. Looked sort of almost like a dungeon. And back in the early 1900s, it even had a electric wire fence around the top of it that inmates had attempted to escape and were electrocuted in attempting to escape. So it just didn't happen. So when in early 1994, I believe it was, if I remember right, yeah, 1994, I had to sort of look at my notes there. When this did happen, it was very unexpected. There was two inmates. One was named Thomas Bonney, and the other guy, his name is James Stromer. And what happened was that during count time, which those who know prisons knows counting is an integral part to make sure that the inmates are there. And at Central Prison, you had the first count, depending on what time of year it was. If it was in summertime, the counts were a little bit later. And so during this time, it was in the spring. And so your first, what they call first count, was at 7 p.m. And then you had another count at 9:30, and then it started at 11 o'clock. You had a count every hour all night long until 6 a.m. And so on the first count, these guys were missing. And so when you do a count and you have inmates missing or your numbers off, and that was not unusual to happen. The part where I worked in at one point, I was involved in that. My office handled putting the numbers, and as a housing control officer, I did that myself as well. And so people would go count their areas. They would call the numbers into you. You would basically add them up, figure out where everybody's at. If you got someone who was not in their location somewhere else, say like they were not in their housing area and in the hospital, they would be counted from there. And so you just sort of put the numbers up and come up with the correct numbers. And if all were accounted for, you would have count clear. And this didn't happen. And so when you did have a count that did not clear, especially your first count, evening count, they would basically have all the inmates report back to their assigned housing area and do another count. And so when they did that, they didn't find them. So then you start looking at inmates in each housing area to determine who was missing. And so these two guys were found to be missing. Tom Bonney was an inmate who had been on death row. He got a resentencing. He hadn't been resentenced. He was being convicted, but he was waiting to go back for resentencing. And while he was waiting, he was housed in the regular population. He could not leave Central Prison. He had to stay there. Stromer, he was just a regular population inmate. And so in the process of trying to figure out where these guys were at, they just, sort of everything went chaotic. And they started figuring out, Tom Bonney, he was a janitor, worked in the hallway. Stromer, he was a janitor who worked in the hospital. And so in the process of elimination, they determined, or at least they thought they had determined, that they had at some point climbed inside of a trash compact dumpster, and that day was the day the truck would pick it up to take it to the landfill. And so that's how they determined that, okay, this is how they escaped. Well, if you know anything about a trash compactor, you put trash in it, you press a button, it pushes it to the back, and it just keeps pressing it and keeps pressing it. And so they actually thought that they had been killed, that they had been crushed in the compactor. And so the first place to look was at the landfill. And so they looked. We had a bunch of officers went out there. Some of my officers went out there looking through the landfill, trying to figure out what happened. Nothing to be found. And so ultimately, a couple days later, afterwards, I think it was Tuesday, if I remember. It happened on a Friday, and I think it was the following Tuesday, if I remember correctly. Tom Bonney was found in Virginia. He was originally from Virginia. He was in prison for murdering his daughter. A movie was made about him murdering his daughter, and Tony Danza played him, and it was called The Deadly Whispers, and I'll put a link down below to the movie on Amazon if you want to go check it out. But anyways, so what they found was they found Tom Bonney in Virginia close to the cemetery where his daughter is buried. And when they found him, he had a broken collarbone. And in talking to him, what they found out is that when the truck left Central Prison, that they climbed out, jumped off as it was going down the road, and that's when he broke his collarbone. And then several weeks later, Stromer was found actually in Florida. So I mean, it was the kind of thing that it just doesn't happen. And you think, well, what kind of security measures were taken? Well, the key thing with dumpsters in Central Prison, that the room that they were located in had a locked door on it, and anytime an inmate went in that room, they had to be supervised. And this particular dumpster was located, the door to it was in the long main hallway that went from the maximum security building in front of Central Prison all the way back through by the kitchen, all the way up to the hospital, and then on up to what was referred to as the workers' residence building, which is general population, and then on into mental health. So anytime trash needed to be put in a dumpster, it was taken to this one door, and there was a control booth that it was a electronic door that they would have to hit a little button to unlock it, and then it could be pulled open. Well, what had happened is that in order to get in there, they had distracted the officer that was working the booth, and so when they opened it, they act like they were putting in a bag of trash just to sit it inside, which was common during that time. And then later on, when an officer would come to assist, they would put it in the dumpster. So he thought, hey, Thomas Bonney said, hey, I'm set trash in there. So he opened the door, somebody distracted them, and then they went in. But then on top of that, additional security was that there was steel bars over the entrance into the dumpster, and it had a high security lock on it, padlock. And okay, they had to get in it. Well, couldn't really pick it. I mean, modern stuff you could pick it, and right tools you could pick it, but just in general, what the inmates had couldn't. So what had happened is Stromer, working in the hospital, he would bring the trash down from the hospital, escorted by the hospital staff member who was supervised the inmate janitors. And so he would come down, he would open the door up, he would go and unlock the key, using the key from the control booth who held the key, and then they would put the trash in. Well, somehow in all that doing, Stromer was managed to make an impression of the key. And you've seen movies where inmates have done this, take a key and make an impression on the bar of soap, and then they'd make a key. Well, that really does happen. And that's what happened in this situation. He ended up getting a key, making a key, And so when they manipulated staff to be able to get in that room, they were able to unlock the lock. They got inside the dumpster. And then once they got inside the dumpster, they pulled the grate door closed, and they put the lock back on it, so nobody the wiser, nobody think that they were in there. And so then it was just a matter of waiting for the dumpster to be emptied. Well, the dumpster was emptied on pretty much on a regular schedule, and so they had been keeping up with that schedule to know when that was going to happen. And so another part that later on was determined is that they had monitored how much trash was in it to determine if it was actually full or not. Because if it was not full, then there would be a large cavity inside of it, and they could just get in it and wait. Now, there's no way to get out of it, because the only opening was the opening that the trash went into it, and that was the opening that the trash was dumped from. And so they got inside of it. It was locked and secure, and then they just waited. And then the truck came in, escorted by an officer, and they loaded it up. They went and took it to the landfill, and on the way they jumped off, and then away they went. And so that's just not the kind of thing that typically happens. It just doesn't happen. Very unusual. A few people got in trouble over it because of, matter of fact, the one person who worked in the hospital, if I recall correctly, I know they got in trouble. I think they may even lost their job as a result of it, because they allowed the inmate to get a hold of the key. And so the officer who allowed him inside the room initially, he didn't lose his job, but he did get in some trouble. So, and then after that, things were changed in how that door was accessed to keep that from happening again. So, you know, Central Prison, very secure place. Escapes just don't happen. And that's one of those times that an escape happened, and it took a little bit for people to figure it out. So just because the prison is very, very secure, people can figure out ways to escape. Tom Bonney, he played a mental health card. That was how he got out of his sentencing for the death penalty for his murder. He claimed to have multiple personality disorder, and eventually his sentence was overturned to a life sentence, and he is still in prison today in 2024, serving a life sentence for killing his daughter. Stromer, he was in for murder, if I remember correctly. He came back, got some additional time. Both of them were in maximum security after that, when they were brought back to Central Prison and stayed that for many years before they were let out back into regular population. So just one of those stories that I thought you would find interesting, about how an escape occurred at a maximum security prison from a former death row inmate. And so until next time, more stories to come. Have a great day and be safe out there.